Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Philippine.net Users Group online dev session. Good evening. Magandang gabi sa inyo lahat. My name is John Limhap. I'm the community manager of the Philippine.net Users Group, and I'm a principal developer for a company called PageUp. And tonight, we're going to have two speakers, hence a double header, talking about Blazor and talking about their experiences and sharing their experiences about using it for their work. But before we go to that, so let's just a few words for our sponsors. We would like to thank it's not moving. There you go. The .NET Foundation for hosting this event. Thank you very much for always helping us. And if you want to know more about the foundation, visit their website at .netfoundation.org. Also, would like to invite you to join their meetup group, meetup.com/.net virtual user group, so that you would be able to get event alerts, not just for the Philippine.net users group live stream of the online dev session, but also about for the events from around the world, from different .NET user groups, different Microsoft stack groups that out there, talking about everything from web to the cloud to Blazor, all things Microsoft. Where they are discussed in the different talks here, and of course the .NET Conf talks. So all right, let's move our to our event. We've been talking about Blazor, which is the WebAssembly technology of Microsoft, for about a couple of years now, and for many of us, we haven't been able to really have an opportunity to try it at work, and there's some feeling of apprehension for some people, uh, uh, um, especially those who have been burned by how how the whole Silverlight affair went, in the past. So it would. I myself am really curious about how a company called mindzie has used Blazor so far, and what their experiences are in using it for their products. Right. So to introduce our first speaker, um, he's the head nerd and founder and CTO of a company called mindzie. Please welcome Mr. Soren Frederiksen.
Hi, John. Thank you.
Hi, Soren. Good evening. Well, I think it's good afternoon where you are.
In Toronto, Canada.
All right,
Yeah.
awesome. All right, thank you for being here. I'm going to remove myself from the stream now, and then I'll let you take the floor.
Okay.
Go
Thank
for it,
you.
Soren. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. So I was asked to talk a little bit about Blazor, and I think it's hard to talk about Blazor and technology choices without doing some background. I could have brought up on the screen, I could have compared it to Angular and Blazor and see what are the features and what are the benefits, and say that's what you select on. But none of us select technologies in a silo. So I want to go a little bit more depth, and some of it also covers philosophy of development because it's part of all of it. So just to start off, it's actually one of my kind of favorite quotes in life, and how very much minds you develop and how we build our things. This picture, by the way, is taken last week when I went for a morning swim, something I do fairly often in the ocean to relax. And one of the interesting things in a picture like this, there's not a lot of stuff on this picture. And I think a lot of people will say that this is actually, that looks nice, it's very pretty. So I do think that when we develop, the most important is to try to figure out not to kind of keep adding stuff to our development, right? So very often when we develop stuff that doesn't work, people will put layers on instead of going back to the fundamentals. And a guy like Elon Musk is very good at talking about this first principles. Let's go to the bare bones and see what's going on. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it has a big impact on exactly what John just talked about on Silverlight, Microsoft history, and why do we choose Blazor? Like, why do we trust Blazor now on this stuff, right? So I changed this quote actually from perfection to excellence, because I don't think perfection is achievable, but excellence is. And one of the things we do a lot as developers is we release stuff and then we iterate over it and make it better and better as we go. So nothing is kind of perfect out of the gate. It kind of becomes perfect with iteration. One other thing I think that's never talked about enough in development is development is a technical skill, right? Software development is technical skill, but product development is not. Product development I find more as an art than a skill, and figuring out how do we make a good user experience. My title is actually head nerd. I'm a proud nerd. I still develop quite a bit. But often us nerds forget the user in the screen, right? Often I hear stuff like, yes, but it's working on my computer, or I know how to do this, but we forget the interaction with the user. So having some of this in here, what we do at mindzie is taking technology and making it really simple for users that does not need a PhD to use our tools. That's kind of our main goal of what we do. So translating our technical stuff into very, very simple to use tools. And it is not just the UI that needs to be simple, right? It's everything in development to the maintenance all the way through. So if also to you guys spending time with I appreciate it. It's like, why should you even listen to what I'm talking about, right? So a little bit about my background, and you can find this on LinkedIn as well. I did neural network development in the 90s, which is quite a long time ago. I mean, I started developing maybe before some of you were born. So I've been doing this for a long time. That doesn't mean I have to be good at it. I could be bad at it for a long time, but I've spent a lot of time on different levels of development. So neural networks were the beginning. If some of you guys know that Jeffrey Hinton is the big guru, he's in deep learning. He's one of them. He actually started here in Toronto, Ontario. Around the same time I was actually doing it, but neural networks didn't really take off. He started early 90s, actually late 80s. And neural networks haven't really started taking off, and AI, we didn't really hear about it until 2012. So it was a long ramp up for the technology to actually be introduced. So Blazor is just starting, so it'd be interesting to see how quick is the adoption rate on Blazor. But AI took almost 20 years. 2012, they did a seminal paper on ImageNet, and that really took off. So all this stuff we did in the early 90s, it all worked. It was just too early. Technology wasn't fully there. Computers weren't fast enough. So the market just wasn't ready. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the technologies we use. It's almost taken this 20 years to get fully to market, at least in North America. After this, I actually started a company and this is relevant for our talk a little bit about technology selections. I started a company around 2003 where we had the choice between using C# or Visual Basic. So I came from C++, did low-level development, did some UI development as well in C++. Any of you remember MFC? That was back then. It was actually Visual Studio introduced. Started in Turbo Pascal even before that, but have grown up with Microsoft and actually seen the implementation of Visual Studio from version 1 pretty much all the way up through what it is now. When I created the last company, IView Systems, and where you guys might know of it, if you're from the Philippines, you're probably familiar with Macau, which is right across. Not that close, but it's not that far from you guys. And if you go to any casino in Macau and you do anything bad, you steal, you cheat, hopefully you don't, but if you do, they end up writing a report about you. That report ends in a software called iTrack. And every single casino in Macau uses iTrack, which is the software we built, which I started. It started as a WinForm app. So we started as WinForm, and it then grew all the way up to becoming a web app. And then at the very late stages, it became a true SaaS offering where everything was in the cloud and everything was online. So I've kind of seen the progression of going from a client server app and switching it over to a fully SaaS enabled app with multiple tenants and then multiple users in one app. And and I have also seen all the mistakes we made up in the 14 years and truly the cost of having technical debt. One of my best decisions we made back then, we almost chose Visual Basic because it had a lot more tooling back in the day. I am so glad we didn't. C# was brand new, it was out in version 1 and then 1.1. Is kind of when we started this. The tools weren't really there yet. There were some bugs in it, but it was the best decision we ever made because Visual Basic, if anybody who's tried it, you only get so far with Visual Basic and then you just got to start doing workarounds. And I feel Visual Basic, I'll talk more about it. For me, Visual Basic and JavaScript have a lot of similarities, and that's one of the reasons I'm going with Blazor for our company. So what are we actually building at mindzie, right? What does mindzie do? And at our core, one of the things we do is something called process mining. Let me just see if there are any questions here. No, not so far. So please ask questions if you have, and I'll try to answer them the best I can as we go along. So process mining is a technology that was actually started by a professor in the Netherlands, a guy called Villena, and it was in 1999. So it's an old technology when you kind of think about it. There's very little adoption of process mining yet in North America. There's large adoption in Europe. And what process mining does, and if I actually just try to show you a little bit of our tool now, I can show you what you can actually do with process mining, but it's only a part of our technology, is you can extract data out of process systems. So, and process systems could be any ERP system that you have, anywhere where you enter in a process. And the one that I'm showing here is just an invoice for paying in, it's called accounts payable, and it's where you pay your invoices in a company. So the process you would like to happen is the vendor sends you an invoice, you enter the invoice in your system and you pay it, right? That's what should happen in your process. If we look at here, when we've extracted data, and this is anonymized data from a real company, what they do most of the time, actually in 28% of their cases, we can actually show them that most of the time what they do is they get the vendor invoice, they actually miss the due date even before they put it into their system, and then they pay the invoice. So this is obviously not desirable, and we can show them things. So process mining takes data from ERP system, extracts it out, and presents it in a form that a user can use. So when we wanted to build process mining, we had to kind of figure out what are the parts in doing that, right? We have to extract stuff out of ERP system. To improve processes, we want to use AI tools to figure out where things are good and bad and learn from previous mistakes and learn from different tenants in our environment. So we have to be able to integrate with AI tools and not build our own. We only wanted to be in the cloud. So we decided when we're doing this, we're not going to go on premise with any of our stuff. There's so many more benefits from being in the cloud with continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is from somebody who has been delivering software on site for almost 12 to 14 years. It is a much easier process, and it's a much better experience for the user having the ability to update more frequently, not have to rely on their own IT. So a cloud for us was a must. And then there are really only kind of three major suppliers of cloud services. There are others. IBM you could put in here. I don't really consider IBM, not for the market we're in. And then some of the things we had to build some very proprietary algorithms. There's a lot of open source and research papers on process mining. So we had to build all these algorithms, and a lot of them came from Java or Python. So the whole industry came from Java, Python, so we would have to actually implement those algorithms. So the algorithms you saw on the screen to lay out that graphical map, for instance, came from a paper that we read, and there were samples in JavaScript. So it's not JavaScript, sorry, in Java. So obviously picking Java would have been a simple choice, right? We could have just picked Java, and then we could have used open source libraries for that. So one of the reasons we didn't choose Java, and one of the reasons we don't just take sample code pretty much ever, is if you put any code in your system and you have to support it, so you have to maintain it down the road, if you don't understand it and something goes wrong and there are no support for it in big industry development, you're in trouble, right? Because something always breaks in our code most of the time, right? So what we've done very often is, even if it had been Java, we would have to understand the algorithm, how it's implemented very deeply. So rewriting in another language is not a big deal. So we didn't choose Java. So some of the first things we actually also looked at when we did this is what are the things that we're building, right? This was early on in the stage. I won't show that many architectural diagrams because I don't think it's that relevant here, but we have 3 pillars that we kind of have to do. We have our extraction stage where we pull data out of large ERP systems, and we support a little more than 20 of them currently, and its list is growing. So there's a lot of different databases or APIs we have to integrate with. So we had to find a language that would easily go to databases and would easily also extract out of REST APIs or SOAP APIs. We had to build an engine portion, and that's the development I'm still very heavily involved in. And the engine is really all the algorithms that you see behind the scenes, everything that calculates stuff. And this is where open source has a lot of that in Java, and a lot of it comes from Python. Python, I don't think, is a great tool for production. I know people do. I just don't like it as much. There are lots of tools that now take Jupyter notebooks and turn them into production-ready stuff. I'm not a big fan of that, and I'm not a big fan of Java either. So engine also needed to be really fast. Speed was a fairly big portion of this, but integration with AI tools was a bigger one. Again, Python is the best tool there, but there are now other alternatives, especially with the cloud providers. You can use other tools to integrate with. So the third part of this is actually the presentation to the user. The ability for the user to play with this data, set up some of the pieces they want, and so a whole UI layer. So each one of these 3 layers, we probably spend equal amount of time on. They'll look different in our history on where we spend it. So Blazor would only be one part of it, but where you can see Blazor has a huge benefit is development talent that goes in our UI side. It would be nice if they can move into the engine and the extraction side and understand what's going on. It just makes them better UI presentation people. So if you have JavaScript skills and you have Angular skills, it's not as easy to dive into a C# backend library if you've never done it before. And I haven't found that many developers. There are some that can go all the way across these different things. But usually you tend to be really good at one language, maybe 2. But the fewest of us can actually handle 3, 4, 5 different languages and be really good at all of them. So having a language common across all these pillars, we found was a very nice thing to have. It's not a must, but it makes it a lot easier. So technical debt's the other one when you have here. After we've been doing this a couple of years, you need to be able to maintain these versions, and that's definitely one of the things I've seen in the .NET library. If any of you have been part of it for a long time, upgrade path in .NET have been not flawless, but it's been really good. It hasn't been difficult. I've gone from .NET 1 all the way up to .NET 6, and then we converted to .NET Core after that. That was probably the trickiest part so far. And the other thing is also the scalability of all this stuff, right? We need to be able to make something that's fast enough and scales well enough without necessarily have to break everything into microservices to the very start of it. I just saw the question down there, but okay. So this is some of the things we're building, and you can see some of the names of the ERP systems. If you're familiar with these kinds, it's not really relevant what they are, but they're the big players in the space of ERP, and also some smaller ones. So the first thing we had to choose is actually a cloud environment, and now I'll kind of getting closer to a little bit of talking about Blazor. There are these 3 that I mentioned, I think, that are the series for what we wanted to do. And one of the things we did early on is we actually applied for Microsoft. I've grown up with Microsoft, really like them. It doesn't matter that AWS is bigger than Microsoft. They're catching up, but still AWS is probably the biggest. And AWS has some really, really nice services. we did not want to be cross-platform, so we don't have to be able to deploy on any of these. We could probably still, but it's not really something we want. We would rather pick one of these and then really utilize their services. Because benefit, you can see on the right just some of the services we use. These are just a part of them. And we do already use all of these Azure services, which has cut our development down tremendously. I have always found Microsoft is one of the best companies for tools. And if you look at down below, there's a guy that I highly suggest you look up. Anders Hausberg he's the founder of Turbo Pascal, which was not Microsoft at the time. It was Borland. He then developed Delphi, Borland, and he's the father of C#. He was a big part of switching Microsoft from COM and OLE, which was a pretty bad technology way back, and switching over to .NET. So this whole community here, you kind of thank him as one of the people that said, we can't fix OLE and COM anymore. And that's what I kind of talked about in the beginning. If they had kept fixing OLE and COM, which is a terrible technology, is really, really complicated to use, it would have been another layer on top of that and fixing. So he's also the guy now behind TypeScript, a lot of TypeScript. He's part of TypeScript, not the only guy obviously behind it. And TypeScript is really fixing all the problems with JavaScript, large-scale JavaScript. Not the only thing, but it makes JavaScript type safe, and it gives a lot of better tooling for JavaScript as well. That I find is an unfortunate thing to do. I understand why they have to, because JavaScript is so much everywhere. But what I would find is a much better if you can get rid of TypeScript and JavaScript altogether. That would be a much better solution, and that's one of the things Blazor actually presents. So talking about Silverlight, it's actually a very good question. I got burned by Silverlight. I didn't use Visual Basic very much, and I stayed away from OLE and COM as much as possible. But Silverlight, we did actually choose earlier on as a company, and got burned with a fairly large project we had that died. And looking back on that, it's very different. Silverlight is very, very different than what Blazor is. Silverlight was proprietary technology that used ActiveX to run it all. And ActiveX wasn't supported on all browsers. The newer stuff,
Soren? Yeah, I think we lost him a little bit.
second, Sean. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Was I back for? Was I gone for a bit?
You were gone for about 10 seconds or something like that.
Okay. All right. I think I can pick it up from there. So so and I think it's okay to move on now, John. Thanks. So now it's kind of coming down to the thing we're kind of talking about. So why Blazor and all this stuff, right? We could have chosen, and some of the alternatives that I've shown that we did explore. I mean, we could have chosen Java, Python, or C# as a backend, right? Java would have made it easier for algorithms. Tooling I don't find nearly as good as C#. I don't have as much experience in Java as I have in C#. So we wanted to run with C# if at all possible, definitely as a backend. We could have built a REST API in our on all of our stuff, and then put Angular or React in the front end, or use ASP.NET MVC. I believe ASP.NET MVC will be supported for a long time because there's so much developed in it. But I think it's like once people start using Blazor, I think more and more would want to switch over there. I can't see why you would stay with MVC. It's a much better experience in Blazor when you actually start using it. So we could have done that. We looked at all of them, but again, the problem was that the back end and the front end are now different developers. So it could have been done that way, and we actually looked at it. We did some early pilots of it, and we had some people that knew Angular and React, but we finally chose, let's go fully with Blazor. Right? If you look at any of the things coming out of Microsoft, there's so much focus on Blazor. And when you use Blazor server side, there's no browsers you don't support. They can't really yank out a technology in the browser side to kill Blazor, like what happened to Silverlight, right? They could have kept supporting it, but a lot of the browsers probably weren't going to keep supporting ActiveX, and they could have found other ways. But it's not nearly as fragile as Silverlight was. So the other thing that was huge is actually being able to carry on libraries that come from the extraction side all the way at the bottom, all the way to the front end. Like sharing of code and libraries we build up, it's a lot of cost in developing all that. And having those libraries be able to go across and not just use NuGet packages for all of it, because again, you lose a little bit of understanding when you go to NuGet unless it's well supported and it's big in the industry. So, so there's several reasons for Blazor, but the standards and the fact that it supports all browser, you have the server side and the client side, which I know Kedren will talk a little bit more about. But if we just want to talk about that a little bit and why we chose also to go server side. So we chose to go server side Blazor for two main reasons. The biggest one was probably we can control the speed of what's happening. If we go more to the client side, and if we did any algorithm development on the client side, we would be relying on the client's browser and his hardware. And we didn't want to do that. We don't have millions of users, and we never will. We have large companies and a few users that expect things to run quickly. So we don't mind paying for the server hardware to run all this and only present the UI layer. I know that could have been done also with a REST API and having a client side, but especially as we're building up our tools, we don't have to build a full REST API, build those layers until we're fully baked on our products. So it is much easier to start with server side also because you are right next to the database, so you don't need to introduce that layer of the client side, server side, talking back to and forth to each other. You can directly, like you could in web forms, which is not a great technology, or any of the things that ran purely on the server, you can do it straight on the server and you don't have to do any communication. The other thing we then have control over is the memory. We load very, very large data sets, millions and millions of records that kind of consume up to like a gigabyte of memory because we're going to analyze them quick enough and it's not fast enough to do it out of the database. So having also that in the server side makes it easier, especially to scale, prototype, and run really quickly on the server side. The other thing that server side Blazor gives for the kind of at my level, or when I think about this stuff, is it gives protection of your code, right? Anything you send through the browser, even though it's compiled, is you gotta assume somebody can look at it. And that's okay for a lot of our code. It's not that proprietary, but some of our algorithms are. We spend a lot of money on it. We're not an open source company. So we want to protect our source code, and server side does that, right? Nothing, and Kedren will explain how that works, but nothing is sent of the code, the C# code onto the client side. We do use client side for some of the things. We do it for some compression algorithms where it's much faster. And there we were actually able to write a lot of that stuff in C# instead of JavaScript. So I don't know if you haven't guessed it already, I'm not a big JavaScript proponent. I understand why people develop in it because there's so much code written in JavaScript. So I think the other thing I didn't really touch upon here, but I think that's important is if you select Blazor for a technology, you've got to realize that the tools are not there yet as broadly as they are in others. And I can actually, let me just go for, as the last couple of minutes, just show that our tool that we have and show actually a little bit more of what we do and show some of, I know Kedren will talk about it too, a little bit more of the problems and good side. So it's very easy to create an experience where this seems like a spa app, right? A single page application. And it seems like everything is running on the client browser. But whenever you click on anything here and you drag these, it's actually sending all of this stuff to the server using the Signal-R connection. And then the updated DOM is sent back to you. But you don't really experience the latency unless you're doing high turnover stuff. So there is a lot of libraries already that you can use. So actually, let me show this one. I don't want to go too much about what our tool does. I don't think it's as important. But this library, for instance, is actually a JavaScript library that we use for charting. There are tools, and we use, unfortunately, SyncFusion as one of our tools for this. But the way they've wrapped their tool in Blazor is that it's not done very well. So the speed of Blazor didn't really happen because they just took their old tool and wrapped it and didn't do a good job. So here we actually wrapped it in a known JavaScript library on our own. And this is much faster. I mean, you can drag and drop these things as if you're on the client side, and you're actually going back and forth to the server when you do this kind of stuff. So that was an option, right? So you can use any off-the-shelf JavaScript application. You just need to build a little bit of wrapper around it, which was it's not a massive cost. And you can see some of our tools. These are also some, like a lot of charting packages that we use are the same one. If we now start showing you some of the problems there are, and if you actually start using and looking at any of the data, this is now showing a grid, for instance, where we have to now rewrite this because this is an off-the-shelf tool where they're not using the benefits of Blazor. And it's one of the things we're rebuilding, where you have something called virtualization, and you can actually just show the records on the screen that you want. You don't have to download all the data here to the client side. Right, you basically only show a version of you scrolling it. So this is a control we're actually replacing. We're in the midst of replacing this to do this a lot better in Blazor. So if you're willing to go with the Blazor, I mean, we are all in on Blazor. We don't have an alternative. We're not going to switch back. We have chosen to do our whole stack, and everything we do is in Blazor. And I think our speed of development is much higher if we used any other technology. That's one of the benefits we've had. But you have to just be aware of some of the tooling earlier on in your life. So in the development life. So I don't know if I have that many more. I don't see if there's any questions. So I think that kind of wraps up what I have to talk about. Hopefully that gives a little bit of high-end experience.
Yeah, all right. All right, thank you.
Oh, are you cutting out, John?
I think we did have one question here, which I'm going to show.
Yeah.
Yeah, give me a moment here.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, Prem. Does it is, I guess he said he means, is there any side effect performance issue by using cascading parameter and cascading value in big enterprise application? I'm not sure what he meant by this, but he asked this around the time we were explaining about the old enterprise systems that you were building before you went into Blazor.
Yeah, there are performance issues with parameters. It depends. So I'm not the right guy to ask. I don't know deep enough in the parameters of Blazor. Kedren might be able to answer that better, or one of our other guys actually to answer this question directly.
Mm-hmm.
Kedren's going to talk a little bit about that, where there are some speed issues and some things to watch in Blazor. Hey, John, are you there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think internet is going bad from both our sides. Yeah. Hopefully, hopefully that answered his question. There are a few more questions here, though.
Okay.
From PGK Lada. Hi there. How are you satisfied with the Blazor performance, both server and client side?
We are very happy with it. We found that anywhere we had problems with the performance was actually the tool manufacturer for Blazor or us making mistakes, not Blazor itself. We haven't found any direct problems in Blazor that we didn't cause, right? Where we misunderstood something and did something wrong, but all our tools run really fast. So no performance problems that we've kind of not been able to solve.
All right, that's good to know. And then, I myself am curious about something that you said earlier about the part where you said something about NuGet preferring Blazor over NuGet packages, and trying to figure out what the scenarios are or what the use cases are. I mean, where would a NuGet package be preferable or something? I guess it's part of it sounds like it's a choice between something that's available as an API or something that's available as an online capability versus something that you could import it
I'm just going to turn my
something.
camera off because I can't.
Mm-hmm. We can still hear you. Are you there? Sorry,
John. I have a hard time hearing you. It's cutting out.
oh, all right. What what I was asking about is NuGet packages versus Blazor apps. What's the story on that? Or is there did you have any experiences in preferring Blazor over creating a NuGet package or for some sort of capability or some sort of functions? Oh, we lost Soren. I'm so sorry. All right. He is reconnecting. Give us a moment here.
I'm not sure what's happening, but you hear me again?
Yeah, I can hear you, Soren.
Good.
All right. So my question was about NuGet packages versus Blazor,
Yeah.
Blazor apps. Yeah. What was the context on that? What's better on Blazor that doesn't work on NuGet?
So, I mean, you can't use NuGet obviously. You need to use .NET Core, right? So you need to use or .NET. We switch everything to .NET 5. So if you use, there are NuGets that are not supported if they're old .NET 4.6 or something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But most of the newer NuGet packages would work. So on the server side, it's not a problem at all. Anything will pretty much work because you're not downloaded to the browser. Things that download to the browser, you have to use Core. If you use Core, there's still a few calls that are not supported on the browser side. But on the server side, we found very little NuGet we couldn't use because of Blazor. And it's mainly because the NuGet did not operate in .NET Core, not because of Blazor itself. So yeah, we heavily use NuGet for a lot of things.
All right. We've got one more question here. Have you encountered any browser version limitations? Have you tested in Safari, for example?
So yeah, browser is always fun. We've had some issues with some of them, but again, it's nothing. We haven't been able to solve it so far. So it's not like they're not supported. We've had some issues with layout, right? Where they lay out slightly different, but that is more of an HTML and CSS issue than an actual Blazor issue. So because I mean, that's really what ends up being generated by Blazor, right? It's just HTML on the client side. So it hasn't been because of Blazor, it's been because of just HTML and CSS we've had problems with. But it fully works on all the major browsers. I mean, we support Safari, Chrome, Edge. So are the main ones that we support, and so far they've worked without problem. Well, not without problem, without solvable problems. So,
all right. Yeah. Have to be really clear about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't always. All right. So I think that's all the time we have for the first half of this session. So thank you so much, Soren, and yeah, hopefully we'll get another chance to talk with a better internet connection on both sides. I think I also cut off a little bit at some point.
Thanks, John.
Right. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, yeah, we'll talk to you soon. All
Yep.
right. Yeah. That's it for our first talk, and I hope you found that interesting. Now, um, now that Sori has given like the business case for using Blazor in their in their applications for mindzie. The next speaker is going to talk a bit more in depth about how that application development went and what their experiences are and putting it out for production use. All right, so please welcome Kedren to talk to us about Blazor server. Good evening, Kedren.
Hey John, good evening. Hey everyone. How are you guys?
All right, so let's get on with it. I'll give the floor to you, Kedren.
Okay, I'll just start sharing my screen. One sec. Mm, Is it showing, John? Is it working as expected?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so hi everyone, good evening. So I'm Kedren Villena. So I'm one of the developers here at mindzie. And earlier you heard from Soren, like from a high level perspective, right? From a CEO perspective, why we chose Blazor. And honestly, with Blazor, it helped us deliver the product basically in a very short amount of time. And we were able to focus on delivering the product rather than studying the technology. I think that's one of the biggest things that Soren mentioned earlier, right? And with what we have right now, all of our developers can actually work in the front end and the back end. Like we want to remove the division between the two, right? Meaning if we need help on database or on UI, basically everyone can jump in, right? There's no point person to, like, we don't have to wait for anyone. Basically, we can support the whole stack because of this one. So for my talk, what I'm going to be focusing on is some of the things that we have learned in terms of using Blazor server in production. So hopefully, if you guys are planning to use Blazor server or is already using Blazor server, some of our experiences here might help you. So let's start with, oh, okay, let's start with Blazor server. Okay, so as you all know, there are two versions of Blazor, Blazor server and Blazor Wasm, right? I think that's how they named it now. So let's start first with the Blazor, a quick comparison. So a Blazor server basically, it's all the state management, all the event handling are being done on the server side. It's being communicated from the browser. Basically, if you click a button, it's going to be the event, it's going to be sent over to the server for the computation to happen, and it can update the element. Basically, once it's done rendering, it can give it back to the server, I mean, to the browser to update the DOM elements, right? And client side, it's your typical SPA application, like your Angular or React or Svelte, but the difference is that it's only using the C Sharp, the .NET runtime that is built on WebAssembly, meaning you can still use C Sharp, right? Of course, there are some downsides to it and there are some upsides to it. I'm not going to be focusing on them. There are a lot of articles and there are a lot of videos and documentation that can help you on that one. What I want to focus on today is our experiences, and hopefully you will learn something from it as well if you are planning on using Blazor Server. So what I want to focus on now is Blazor Server. So if you go to the Microsoft or to the AS or to the official documentation of Blazor, you can actually see two flavors there. And for the Blazor Server, the main definition is stated as the app is executed on the server. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Oh, there. On the server from within an ASP.NET Core app or an ASP.NET app. UI updates, event handling, and JavaScript calls are handled over a Signal R connection. Take note, some of the text here are in bold. The reason for that one is I'm going to be focusing on them later on. So to give a quick overview of what's happening, on the left side, you can actually see the browser. And then on the right side, this is actually the server. This is where Blazor is running. So what happens is that each connection, for example, if you go to a website that is using Blazor server, the browser actually initiates a communication to the server via the Signal R. So Signal R basically handles all the communication, all the passing of data, all the event handling, all data passing in between the client and the server, right? So let's try to put it in another perspective. If you're using, let's say, another version, let's say Angular or React, basically what happens is if you click something, and you're gonna go fetch data from an API. So you're gonna do an HTTP call, right? But there's no signal R for you. It's just a plain old HTTP call to an RESTful endpoint. With Signal R, we don't have to worry about that one because all those things are being handled by Signal R. So, but what is Signal R? So Signal R is basically an open source library that simplifies adding real-time web functionality to your application. So imagine if you want to get some, let's say you have a typical web application and you want to get data from a RESTful endpoint, right? What you usually do is do an HTTP call, like you go use a post or a get HTTP call to an endpoint, right? And you get the data. Once you get the data, it might be served in a different formats. Like it can be an XML format, or it can be a JSON format, or whatever it is that the endpoint is giving back to you, right? And you have to understand, okay, how do we parse that data? What's the amount of data that we can actually store on the browser, right? For example, do you think that a 1 gigabyte, or let's say, let's just go to a more realistic example. Do you think that a data table with 500,000 rows can you actually give it back into just one HTTP GET call? I don't think that's possible because the browser might run out of memory, or it's going to be very taxing on the client side or on the browser side to render them. Even if you use virtualization, there are limits that you need to understand, and you have to think of them if you're trying to start from scratch, right? But with Signal R and with Blazor Server, you don't actually have to think about those things. We just focus on returning what you want to return, and Signal R basically, and Blazor Server will do that one for you. Also, another good thing with Signal R is it basically switches between 3 different techniques. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with, I think WebSocket is the most common one, right? WebSocket is usually being used nowadays with the WSS protocol. There are also other techniques, the server sent events and the long polling. I'm not going to discuss them in detail, so feel free to research them. But the good thing with Signal R is it will automatically switch between the 3. For example, for some weird reason your WebSockets are blocked, Signal R can use long polling or server sent events. Signal R will automatically determine the best connectivity depending on the current setup of the client. So that's how good Signal R is. And if, let's say you're concerned about scalability, Azure even has a Signal R service that you can actually get, and it's very easy to combine it with ASP.NET applications or even C# applications in general. So, but enough about Signal R. Now let's focus on the things that we have learned with Blazor Server when we are using it in production. Number 1. So what I want to focus on is I want to go back to the previous sentence, the one that is on the definition of Microsoft on Blazor Server. Let's talk first on the text here, on the server. Okay. When we say on the server, I think it was also mentioned by Soren earlier. In mindzie, what we are doing is we are doing a lot of computational data, right? Sometimes some of those data needs to be done by the UI logic, right? We cannot totally remove it from the UI logic. There are instances wherein we really have to bake it in the UI logic because it's part of it, like filtering or doing some kind of data manipulation on the real time. And take note, the data that we're handling, it's not just mere 500 rows, whatever. We're dealing with, as what Soren mentioned earlier, hundreds of thousands to millions of records. Okay, we're handling those amounts of data. And imagine if we don't use Blazor Server, or we don't use what we're using right now. We have to learn on how to do paging. Whenever we do some kind of execution, we need to send it over to the server via HTTP call, wait for some latency to happen, etc., etc. Those kinds of things. But with Blazor Server, what we're maximizing is the execution speed of those things. Why? Because take note, if you remember earlier from the earlier slides, DOM manipulation, or basically the state management, happens in the server, not on the browser. Meaning, the browser is only focused, it's just a lightweight client for presenting the rendered or the final DOM elements, or the final HTML elements, while the server takes care of designing and handling what needs to be displayed on the server, on the client side, rather. So, and if you think of it from another perspective, if everything is done on the server, you have something that is not available on the browser. I'm not sure if you guys can guess it, but multi-threading. Okay, if you're a developer, if you're a web developer, chances are, or 90, I think you should know this one, right? That a browser will only give you a single thread, right? So your React, your Angular, they're just using one single thread, but they're using promises. That's why it looks like it's doing multiple things at the same time, but it's still a single thread. At the end of the day, it's still a single thread executing one line of code. No matter how many context switch you do, it's still just one single thread, right? However, if you go with server side, for example, Blazor Server, this is something unique. You can actually maximize the number of threads inside the server. So a good example for this one would be, I think, from Soren's screenshot earlier. Like if you watch Soren's presentation, our application actually has several components to it. It has a left sidebar, and then it has a lot of block components that are chained with each other. When we load that page, for example, we have 5 blocks inside a component. Those 5 blocks, we can actually render them using 5 different threads on the server, which is through multi-threading, not just one thread during context switching. There's a big difference between that one, right? 5 threads actually executing 5 lines of code at the same time. It's much, much better compared to one thread that's doing a context switching. So that's one of the advantages that we have when we're using Blazor Server. And imagine if 5 of them have its own data set, and even if they're sharing the data set, they need to do some kind of computational value onto it. It's going to take a lot of time. Remember, we're handling thousands and hundreds of thousands to millions of records here. So that's the power of Blazor Server for our use case. And take note, of course, it's not always just rainbows and butterflies and alls for this one, right? We also need to understand that, did it move? Okay. If you're using a multi-thread UI, if you're using multi-threading, especially on the UI, and I'm just going to go back to a bit of C# basic. I'm not sure how many of you guys have used WPF or WinForms or those typical C# UI development. There's a concept of a UI thread. Even on the server, even on the browser side, there's a concept of the UI thread, right? What you want to do is to never block the UI thread, right? But you want to get it the moment that you're done computing value and you want to render something on your browser. So one of the big learnings that we found here is that if you're gonna do multi-thread rendering for Blazor Server, you have to make sure that you get the UI thread, okay, and that you don't block the UI thread. Okay, blocking the UI thread it can actually make your Blazor Server application slow and not responsive at all. So you have to be very careful with it, but there are techniques to do it. You just need to get back the UI thread. So that's one of the things that we've learned from this one. Okay, so moving on, the next thing that I want to talk about is, I think it was mentioned earlier, signal R connectivity. On Blazor Server, clients needs to, yes, I know for some of you this might be a throw off, but there's actually several advantages to it. Being always connected means that you can track which users are online. You can easily give them notifications on the fly, like a real-time notification system, okay? And you can also do a lot of other things with regards to getting the connection alive, because you can easily know, like for example, if the client gets disconnected, right? All of the updates that he or she was doing, basically, it can actually be saved. Or the good thing with that is, before he or she can proceed with doing anything, if the connection is blocked, then it's also an immediate feedback to the user that, okay, we cannot do anything because you don't have internet connection. That's also a good experience to a certain degree. Like, it depends on how you want to go for it, but for ours, it's actually a helpful technique for us in order to handle those scenarios. Of course, there's some things that you have to be very careful with. So a downside of being always connected is always being connected as well, because you have to take care of something that's called the latency, right? So in Blazor Server, there is for Microsoft, there's a recommended latency of at least 200 ms for a very, very good user experience. What we tried is we tested it on basically from the Philippines and to the US servers. There's around 300 plus ms, and when we did our optimizations, even if it's 300 ms, it's still a good experience. So it's just a matter of learning the Blazor lifecycle. And you need to maximize offloading. If you're familiar with the Blazor lifecycle, just make sure that your on initializes a thin layer and put the heavy lifting on after render async. make sure to wrap it in a background thread and get the thread afterwards. I'll explain this more in detail later. But even for latency issues, you can actually have a way with it, right? So after the optimizations that we have done, basically, even if the MS is around 200, it's still a good experience. Of course, there's some degraded experience, but in general, it's still a good experience. Okay, now what I want to focus on next is I want to focus on UI updates and event handling. So let's start with this statement. Okay, UI updates are always, take note, always given to the server. Okay, now some of you might think that this is a negative thing. What does it mean by always given to the server? Let's say you do a mouse click, right? A mouse click rather, like a button click. If you click a button and let's say you're in a typical React or Angular application, when you click the button and you have some logic inside of it, that logic it's being handled by the browser, right? It's being handled by the browser. It's on the client side, right? And then if it's gonna do some API calls, then that's the time that it's gonna pass it to the server via the API call. In Blazor Server, it's different. When you click a button, it's gonna pass that event to the server, meaning the browser doesn't do anything. It just passes that event to the server. Why? Take note. In Blazor Server, the state management, even the DOM state management, it's not handled by the client. It's not on the browser side. All of them are on the server side. So a click on the button needs to be passed to the server because the server needs to understand what's happening. It needs to know those things, okay? So there's some advantages and disadvantages to it, right? For me, the best advantage to this, well, of course, the disadvantage is the latency issue, right? Because you have to pass it to the server and the server will have to handle it. But there's another good thing to that one. The server can actually just spawn another thread. When you do a click button, wrap it in a task, it's another thread that will be handling it, right? Meaning it's still the server that does the heavy lifting. Once it's done, it's just going to get the UI thread back and you can just display the updated value. So that's one of the advantages to it, right? But of course, there are downsides to it. For example, you need to understand that all events are being forwarded to the server. I keep repeating myself because this is very, very important. Okay, so you have to be very, very careful of some events. An example would be on mouse move. Okay, why? If you move a mouse, all that event keeps getting sent to the server because the server needs to know what's happening. It needs to record those events. It needs to update the DOM if needed, right? So you have to be very careful with those kinds of things because everything is being passed to the server, right? So this can be a disadvantage or it can be an advantage. So you have to know when to use them and what events to use for your use cases. For example, if you have an on-input listener, so you can just offload it to JavaScript and then just do the validation afterwards or pass it to the server. It depends on your use cases, all right? So, but this is something that you have to be very aware of. Next is, what I want to talk about is, I just coined this term. I'm not sure if there's a right term for this. It's the simultaneous component loading. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main advantages of Blazor Server rather, is you have the power of multi-threading at your disposal. Meaning, if you have 5 components or more that you want to render, you can take advantage of multi-threading. Take note, I highlighted multi-threading and task because they're very important concepts. So let's say you're going to render 15 components. All of them need to do some data manipulation or some data fetches to the database. You can just maximize the server's multi-threading capability, right? So, and then it's kind of easy to scale those applications, right? You can even wrap this in a container and then it's just going to scale that easily. So the main advantage for this one is if you know how to maximize multi-threading on your server and on your C# code, then you can also apply it on Blazor, on the Blazor server components. That's how good it is. So the key technique here is to learn the Blazor life cycle. Take note, that is very, very, very important. One thing that I want to share, I'll share a technique with this one. What we usually learn from our experience is that you have to make sure that your uninitialized logic, even if it's uninitialized or uninitialized async in the life cycle, make the code as thin as possible. Meaning you don't do database calls there, or you don't do, let's say, long-running processes, heavy intensive database call or manipulation, right? The reason for that one is you have to go back to your UI basics. There's always a dispatcher thread. The moment that you, the one that enters the uninitialize and the lifecycle methods of Blazor, most of the time, it's always the UI dispatcher thread. You don't want to hold that thread for too long because it needs to do other things. It needs to update other components as well, or it needs to react to other things that are happening inside the browser, right? So as much as possible, never hold the UI thread, or if you're gonna get the UI thread, let's say you're done doing something and you wanna get the UI thread, make sure that you call that invoke async or the state has changed method of Blazor so that you can get the UI thread. But there's a known bug to it, like you have to pass a task that delay first before the actual call to it. But it's just a small workaround, but it's working so far. And using multi-threading rendering, it's actually a very nice experience compared to having just one single thread on the client side. And you're kind of limited with the resources of the client, right? So, and the good thing with this one is, even if we're processing lots and lots of rows of data, like thousands to millions of rows of data, we can still do it fast, right? Because we have the power of this, we have the power of multi-threading behind the scenes. So that's one of the big advantages. And guys, I'll in the Blazor website, there's a life cycle, but another website that I'm looking at is the Blazor University. They have a good diagram of the Blazor life cycle. Having a good understanding of the life cycle, I think it also goes the same for React, Angular, and the other SPA applications, SPA framework applications, is that you need to understand the life cycle. And in Blazor, if you know how to maximize the life cycle, then you can also maximize multi-threading. So it goes hand in hand with those two. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about, and I think this is very important. I think Soren also made a demo on this one earlier. JavaScript. So Blazor Server, either Blazor Server or Blazor Wasm, they both can communicate with JavaScript, right? So Blazor code in general has the interoperability, meaning JavaScript can call C# code. C# code can call JavaScript, right? It's vice versa. You can even add NuGet packages, like NuGet libraries inside your Blazor application. So just a short segue, I actually wrote a blog. I was actually curious about it a few years ago. I added a node library, an npm library in my Blazor application, and I'm calling that node library. It works perfectly. It works really, really great. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that blog before, but it was a really good experience. Like, meaning with Blazor, you have the power of the whole node library at your disposal, the whole npm library, or if they work, right? But most of them, you can actually use it. But the good thing, or the thing that you need to be aware of, is there's also a downside to it. We actually experience it when we use a third-party JavaScript library for charting. I think it was presented by Soren earlier. So initially, we use a third-party provider for Blazor that has charting libraries. But the problem is there were a lot of limitations on their system, and it's gotten to the point that we wrote our own wrapper to some JavaScript libraries, which made it much, much, much faster. That's the experience on it. Oh, thanks, John. So the link showed up. So, okay. So with JavaScript, what's happening is that if you're integrating with JavaScript, if it's just a simple call, like a node library call, then it's gonna work fine as expected. But from our experience, sometimes our JavaScript needs to generate dynamic components. Or, for example, the drag and drop events are on the JavaScript side. We need to communicate it to the server code or to the C# code. Or sometimes our C# code needs to reference an element that was dynamically generated on the client side. Of course, it's going to take some time because of Signal R. It's going to be instant, right? But if you're doing a lot of things, or for example, it's going to happen in an instant, but sometimes the client because our UI is quite fast, sometimes the client can just, for example, we're still loading some things on the back end, and the client moves to another page. If you are not careful with using referencing on C# and Java and vice versa, you might end up with uncaught exceptions, right? So you have to be very, very careful with those things. So to give you an example, So here are some cases. For example, an element where JavaScript is looking, where JS is looking for is already disposed. For example, the user switched pages, or basically it switched to another page, right? So the JavaScript might still look for that element, but it was already, it gotten disposed by Blazor. So you have to be to take note of those scenarios, right? Else your application might crash. Also, another example would be you have a JavaScript callback, right? But the element got disposed already. So you have to be very careful on those things. But nonetheless, the experience with integrating with JavaScript, it has been really, really great for us. I'm not sure if you've seen the presentation earlier by Soren, wherein he was showing this variants, like there's some graph there. It was actually written on Blazor and JavaScript, and it works really flawlessly. Like if you do the drag and drop, you won't believe that a server call is happening on the back end. And that's how good it is. And aside from those things, we use third-party JavaScript libraries that are basically written in JavaScript. We wrote a Blazor wrapper around it. It works perfectly good for us. It's like having your own Blazor component, but in reality, it's just using JavaScript. So if you have some JavaScript libraries that you want to write in Blazor, it's also a good experience as well. But you have to take note of some limitations, right? Because in Blazor Server, take note, all the DOM handling or basically all the DOM state handling are done in the server. There's none on the browser. So the browser needs to communicate everything to the server, okay? And if for some reasons your UI is really fast, like what we're doing, and the user switch to another tab, or I mean to another page inside the application, chances are there might be issues there. So you have to be very careful. Like you can just write try catch around it just to catch those errors, because those errors are something that are not really easy to catch. Like if in production, like in local development, it's not. Sometimes it's really hard to recreate them. Sometimes it only happens in production. So those kinds of things, you have to be very, very careful with it. But using JavaScript with C#, it's the best experience. Like combining them, it's actually a good experience. I know Soren is not a fan of JavaScript, but combining them, it's actually giving us a better experience. And personally, I think what we're doing, combining both of them, it's actually the best approach for now, especially for Blazor. Okay, so another thing that a general rule, well, this is something that we applied on our end. A general rule is we try to anticipate all possible scenarios. It's not possible to anticipate all, right? That's really impossible, right? But at least try to wrap it with try catch so that you can see what's happening. Right now we're still working on it. We have some problems with uncaught exceptions. We're learning from it. So I hope that you guys can also learn from this one as well, right? Because any uncaught exception that involves the UI thread, it's gonna bubble up to the browser side and it's gonna crash the application. So you have to be very careful of those things. Okay, so I just want to quickly wrap up my presentation, and then I'm gonna try to start answering some of the questions. So some of the key points that I discussed was, number one, multi-threading is your best friend. You keep hearing this from me over and over again during this presentation. It's because really, this is the power of Blazor Server, right? I know that a lot of people are afraid with multi-threading. They just rather stick with one single thread and then do promises and callbacks. But there's a really limitation to it. There's a limitation to it. Like if you have the power of multi-threading, why not take advantage of it, right? Especially you have the TPL library for C#. You don't even have to create new threads, right? You just have to do task.run and let the tasks get and let the thread pool decide which one should it give it to you. Even the TPL has helpers for you on that one. You can just use task.factory.start new with the long running as the option. Then it's just going to spawn a new thread, right? So even thread management in C# is not that hard anymore, right? It's quite easy for you as well. You just need to know the basics of threading. So that's actually a good thing with Blazor Server. I think this is something that correct me if I'm wrong, challenge me. I might not be aware of it. But as far as I know, I haven't seen a browser giving more than one thread to a current application. So if the browser starts doing that, then good. But for now, this is a very good advantage of Blazor Server. Next is be careful on events. Okay, like what I said earlier, on mouse down or on mouse move can actually hit your latencies. It can actually send a lot of data to the server. So you have to be very careful on those things. But do not be afraid of it. Like if there's a really use case for it, go ahead and use it. Try to anticipate all possible scenarios with JavaScript. It's not always possible to anticipate them, but at least understanding what can happen or what might happen, it's a very good tool for you. Okay, so I also just want to share some helpful tips of ways from our experience and hope that it can also help you with your journey with Blazor Server. Have a good understanding of threads versus tasks. Even if you're not a Blazor developer, you need to understand threads versus tasks. There's a big difference, okay? All right? Tasks can actually, the context of a task can actually be executed by multiple threads, right? A thread can actually switch between multiple between multiple contexts or between multiple tasks. So you need to know that sometimes using your lock, it's kind of dangerous if you're combining thread and task. So, but you need to have a good understanding of thread versus task, and you can take advantage of Blazor Server. Async versus non-async, when to use this and when not to use this. And Blazor Server, or basically in Blazor, and its life cycle, you're given two options: an async version and a non-async version. For example, on initialized versus on initialized async. When to use those things, right? For us, personally, what I do recommend is for on initialized, try to make sure that you don't use on initialized async. If possible, just use on initialized, because on initialized will guarantee that you're not doing any async call. Meaning, because an async call might be an indicator that you're doing a long-running task somewhere, like doing a database fetch or getting it from an external API. Okay, just put it on the on after render async. That's the best helpful tip on that one. Next is, of course, if you're maximizing multi-threading, you need to know the difference between lock and semaphore slim, right? In lock, take note, it's a thread level. Note that it's not a task context, right? There's a big difference to it. While a semaphore slim, it's basically on a task context, not on a thread level. So just take note that if you don't know the difference between the two, please start reading them now. It's gonna help you on your C# journey, not just your Blazor Server journey. Okay, also another thing that I forgot to add in the slides is we had something that we figured out recently. It actually added a lot of bottleneck on our servers, is that we did something wrong, wherein we're actually giving back the images as a base64, and we did not scale it properly. And even if it looks like it's only a simple process for an on-initialize method, right? Even on on-initialize, what we found out is that the browser can have a hard time rendering it. So for those kinds of things, better to put it on the on-after render async, and then the on-initialize, just put a loading indicator and then delay the loading of those things, right? Because sometimes you really want to use those base64 images because of, let's say, for security issues, those kinds of things. Sometimes you just need to put them on the on-after render async so that your page will load instantaneously. It's going to load instantly. And then just put an indicator that, or a placeholder for your base64 images. And scaling them properly shouldn't hurt you. But we actually improved the speed of our servers or of our applications by more than, I think, 90%, or 80 to 90% because of that. And we were able to fix it using proper scaling algorithms. So yeah, just to finalize my thoughts on this one. So is Blazor Server worth it? I think this is the biggest question. And I know that I actually just saw a comment from my friend that for him, he's not going to go. I think he's still not in the position to be convinced that Blazor Server is good for production. But for our use case, personally, I'm just going to speak from two perspectives. From a mindzie perspective, it was super worth it for us. We were able to focus on delivering the product, not figuring out the technology. If you're from a high-level management perspective, delivering the product is a much, much better experience. Of course, you need to have good coding behind it, right? But instead of us trying to learn how to do pagination, WebSockets, real-time streaming, those kinds of things, instead of us creating those serialization and the client side on the browser side, Blazor Server removed all those problems. Blazor Server basically allowed us to deliver faster. We didn't have to worry about those things. We just focused on delivering the product. And I think that's what made mindzie Studio, our product, have its features. And basically it has a lot of features now, and we're growing the features. And we were able to add features, for example, I think within a week or two, because you don't have to worry about functionality. because we don't have, sorry, yeah, what happened, sorry, because we didn't have to worry about learning new technology. We just need to make it work on HTML and on a Blazor, and we're good, right? And we don't have to worry about C# syntax. Like we just need, we don't need to learn about JavaScript syntax in depth. Of course, we know it, but I think with just the C# syntax, it's already good. And all of our developers can work on the UI, on the back end, and on the server side itself. So meaning we don't have a division of the developers. We can get help from anywhere. They can do database, right? But if you do with the typical development, you have a UI layer, then you have the REST API layer. We don't want to worry about those things. We want to focus on delivering the product. My other answer in this one is from a personal perspective. Honestly, initially I was hesitant, meaning I'm not really hesitant, but I was more of leaning towards the Blazor WASM approach. But when I saw what Blazor Server did for the mindzie Studio for our product, I don't think it's something that Angular or React or I'm not, even if you're really good at it, I'm not sure if what Blazor Server did for us can be done by Angular and React in a short amount of time. And I was surprised because we're handling hundreds of thousands to millions of records, and Blazor Server is doing it in a snap. And it's like when we display it on the browser side, the browser basically is not having a sweat trying to display all those things. It happens so fast. It looks like we don't have a lot of data. But what Soren presented earlier, it has a lot of data behind it. It's like the data where it came from. It has 500 megs of data, up to 1 gigs of data. We're loading it, and the browser is not even complaining because all is being done on the server side. So yeah, I've been talking a lot of things about this Blazor server. So hopefully you guys have learned something. And I'm gonna post my personal email address and my work email. So basically, if you have questions on Blazor server, or if you are interested with Blazor server, so we're open to, we're open to expanding, right? So I think this is also, John, and maybe I can just quickly plug it. But
sure, go ahead.
if you're interested with Blazor server or Blazor development, we're looking for developers as well who are interested and who wants to share the passion that Soren and I have on these things. So yeah, thank you so much for the time, John, and I'm open to questions now.
All right. Thank you so much, Kedren. There are a ton of questions, and a lot
Right.
of them really, at least the first two, is really about scale. Redtoad Games asks, "Are you confident Blazor server can scale?" And I guess the same question is asked by James Amity. Can Blazor client scale easily? I guess that's two different scaling questions, but yeah, from one for the server, one for the client, and I guess we've heard a lot of a bit of the answer from you, but yeah, what can you say about their questions?
Okay, so let's start with the easier one, the Blazor WASM, the Blazor client. So I think it was asked by James Amati, right? So James, to answer your question, Blazor client can actually be scaled easily. Why? You can just have a CDN, have the CDN serve your Blazor client. It's the same as your typical Angular or your typical React on how you scale it, right? Typically, when they scale those Angular or React, they can just have a CDN server and then just host it there. That's how you scale it. It's basically your typical React or Angular application, your typical SPA application, right? But of course, if you do the Blazor client approach, you have to take note that it's still using WASM, right? There's a loading time to it, and in terms of the package size, Blazor WASM, I think it's still much bigger compared to an Angular or to React application because you're downloading basically the whole .NET runtime that is compiled on the WASM side, which is, it might not be a good experience at first because there's a loading indicator, but it's really up to you. But it's scaling it's much easier. Okay, next question, the harder one, the Blazor server. How do you scale a Blazor server? And am I confident that we can actually scale Blazor server? To be honest, it's a yes and no answer. First one is, if you want to offload some of the load on the server, you can use Azure Signal R. Oh, it's a good segue to the Azure Signal R as a service. Azure offers a signal hour as a service, meaning those signal hour connections, your server doesn't have to keep them. You can just make Azure handle them for you. It's gonna make things easier, right? It's gonna make things lighter because you're offloading those communication platform to Azure. The second one is that you have to be aware of is you can put Blazor Server in a Docker container. You can even scale it via Docker container. But you have to take note that you need to enable sticky sessions, right? Because in sticky sessions, sometimes the server can hold the DOM inside of it. It can, if for example, the client wants to reconnect, it can reconstruct the DOM from the existing connection, right? But from our experience, getting a new DOM management or basically getting a new connection, it still happens so fast. So I think scaling won't be an issue, but you have to take note that if you want to scale, you have to take note of the server memory, right? You need to understand, for example, how many clients can go to a server because a server will hold all those information into memory. So you need to understand how much memory are you consuming per app per client, and then if you understand those things, scaling will be much easier.
All right, thank you so much for those answers, and I hope that answers the questions of our audience. There's another question here from Alvin Chua via Facebook. How is your experience rewriting JavaScript events into a Blazor server side event?
How into what do they mean by Blazor server side event? Are
I'm
they
not
are they
sure.
talking about the signal R?
Yeah, I'm not
Or
sure what Alvin meant there.
okay,
But
so okay,
yeah, I guess it's in the
I think I
context
get the
of
question, John.
you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think I get the question now. So think of it as this way. If you click a button, let's say you have a JavaScript element, right? Sorry, an HTML element, you click a button, right? And it's gonna send it back to the server, right? So Blazor Server does those things automatically for you. You can hook up events. I think I mentioned it earlier, right? We can manually hook up events via JavaScript. I think we did that on some of our external libraries. But the problem with that is you have to be very careful that sometimes the element might get disposed, meaning the reference is not there. The component was actually removed by the server application, and JavaScript might encounter an error because it cannot find the reference anymore, or vice versa. You have a dynamically rendered element in your DOM in the client side, and C# on your server side is getting a reference to it. And sometimes the C# code might not yet get it. It's not yet on the C# reference, so it's going to be null. So you might have null reference exception in your code. So for those kinds of things, I think it's more or less having the mindset of a defensive coding in terms of those things would help you a lot. Like just try to wrap it and try catch, and try to prepare for the worst case scenarios for those things. Never assume that a value is not null because you're binding it somewhere else. So I think that's the best way to explain that one.
Yeah, I hope that answers Alvin's question there. Thank you very much. And then we've got this another question from Manoj. What is the impact of connection-related UI interactions on SignalR, especially with respect to scaling a Blazor server app? On
Okay.
mouse moves.
Yeah. So for those kinds of things, what you need to know is that in a Blazor server application or in a SignalR, you are given a dedicated connection. You don't share a connection with another user, right? So let's say, for example, the three of us here, for example, John, me, and Soren, we will have our own connection. So let's say on my end, I have the on mouse move event. Even if I keep spamming it, it won't affect the connection of Soren and John because it's a different kind of connection. They are going on a different hub. It's a different connection. So I think the main point on what I want to point out on this one is it's still an isolated connection. So as long as your server can handle it, or if you want to offload it to Azure, then you're still safe with this one because each connection are treated independently and securely. That's actually the most important part of it, right? Because if we share connection, we might leak data. That's why it's trying to create each connection securely.
All right.
Maybe I have one thing to add, maybe on Kedren on the server side. I don't think I would use server side Blazor if you have a million users that are always connected. So if you're building a game app or anything like that, you'd probably go client side. For us, we will have more memory usage at any point than connections. right? So if we have 1,000 users, our memory would be so large, we would have multiple servers anyway. And like Kedren said, then we use sticky sessions. I know Microsoft have done some tests on scaling the SignalR connections to hundreds of thousands of connections, and it's still working. But it's not really our scenario, and I wouldn't do it. If it was me, I wouldn't do it with 1 million users, for instance, if you want to scale to that. So, probably good client.
Sorry.
Yeah, great point. I guess another thing I wanted to bring up in all of this discussion is again that the advantages and the disadvantages of Blazor client versus Blazor server. One of the things that was pointed out to me is that because the cost of hosting something for Blazor client in a CDN is much lower than having an app service that's taking your API calls or taking Signal R. In some cases, that's much better. But again, if your spa is getting bigger and fatter, that means that there's more loading time upfront on your side. So I guess it's a balancing act between the two, and it really depends on what your application is doing. And this is a great example of Mindsy's applications. It's a great example of something that's well suited for that server Blazor server model. Yeah.
Also, John, to add to your
Yeah, go
point,
ahead.
one of the things I think it was mentioned by Soren earlier, if you have a spa application, chances are, basically it's not chances, it's happening. You are giving your client source code to the browser, right? So if you have some proprietary code there, it's going to be given to the client. It's exposed publicly, right? We want to avoid those things because in Blazor Server, we only give out the final DOM element. We don't give out the logic on how we build those components, right? Because some of the ways that we build some of our components or of our blocks, our logic, some of them are proprietary because there's some kind of like quote unquote proprietary code in it, right? So if you do a spa, like for example a React, you're actually giving the whole source code. It's just it was transpiled to a different format, but it's still the whole source code. Someone can still like deconstruct it, right?
Yep, definitely. All right. I think we have a few more questions coming in. So talking about WASM. So would it be proficient to use WASM with .NET with Signal R for microservices? Interesting.
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so I think there might be a mix up of things here. Okay, WASM doesn't can use Signal R, right? But if you're using WASM, what's the use of using Signal R, right? You can basically, if you want to go microservices, are you sure that you want to go microservices with Signal R? Because I think I'd rather go with an HTTP call hitting RESTful APIs with a WASM application, right? Because Signal R basically keeps one connection open. And if you have let's say you have 10 microservices, 10 endpoints that you want to connect to, do you really want to keep 10 Signal R connections inside the browser? Take note, the browser has a limitation of, I think it's 6 or 7. I'm not sure, I forgot the right number. I think the browser can only keep a 6 or 7 connection open at the same time. So if you're hitting 10 microservices and you have 10 Signal R connections, that's not going to work. You can only have up to 6 or 7. 6, right? I forgot 6 or 7. One of those two. But in Signal R with Blazor Server, all are happening in that one connection. So you still have 6 for other different connections. So I think that's one of the things that you have to point out on this one. So if we're going to be doing microservices, don't use WASM, because WASM you can just do a CDN. Just use microservices on your RESTful endpoints. I'd rather go microservices with Blazor Spa and keep the one Signal R for each instance that I have. I mean, for each client application that I have, and then do the internal routing inside the server itself, because the server can actually be the one to call the internal RESTful APIs.
Yeah. I remember that we 2 months ago we had the talk from Robert Bodhijaimer, and he was talking about this HTTP, the number of connections and the HTTP standards and all of that. So that's also a good talk for everyone listening here. If they want to go back on the YouTube channel, browse back back in, I think that's April. Our April session actually talks a lot about those connections and how many connections that your browser can keep, yeah, that was an awesome session on optimizing your web application. So that might clear up some of the concepts here. All right. I think that's it in terms of questions, and we have run 30 minutes over time, but that's
Sorry
okay.
about that.
Yeah, it's a great session, and I learned a lot. So just like to ask any last words or message from both you, Soren, and from Kedren.
Go ahead, Kedren, if you want to.
Okay, so just a quick closing remarks for me. So I think, yeah, I talked about Blazor Server for a long time already. I mean, yeah. What I want to focus on. So if you guys are interested in trying out Blazor Server, and if you want to find a good like company, and if you think that our philosophies align with you, so you can contact me on LinkedIn, and we can talk about it more. Sorry, I use this as like a marketing material. Sorry, I think it's
That's
better you do the
fine.
final closing words.
Yeah,
Yeah. I hope also. Thanks for the time, by the way, John. It's been great joining you. I hope that there's some people that will look more carefully at Blazor. There's a lot of people that are in companies where you can't choose it, where it may or may not be your choice. But the only way you get stuff like this into your company is do some of it on your own time, right? There's so many sample apps, and they're very easy to get started up. Build some sample apps and actually show your managers how easy some of this stuff is. And a couple of things we didn't talk about, we talked about keep Blazor server side and client side. You can switch the components from the server side to the client side. It's very little development that has to happen. So you can now take a huge application that our previous applications were a massive solution that was hard to compartmentalize. What you can do now is you can create an assembly with CSS, C#, all the code, HTML, all inside one assembly, and you can now start componentizing your websites, which you couldn't do before. So not only join our company, we'd love to have you and love to talk about this stuff, but also start using Blazor because it's a much better technology, right? So try to use it, guys. And if you don't agree with us, please comment on the videos for this, and we'd love to talk about it. We're very passionate about this, but please help us grow the community on Blazor because it's going to be a huge technology in the future. So, and thanks for the time.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kedren and Soren, for your time. And yeah, I hope that your gospel of Blazor will reach more people and more people will be able to use it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. That's it for tonight's session. We ran over time for half an hour, but that's all right. Lots of learnings. It's a totally very interesting technology, and we look forward to everybody's questions on this. I mean, you could do it on YouTube. You could do it on Facebook. Wherever you're watching, please throw out your questions. And I'm going to use this time myself to advertise some openings for my own company. So PageUp's Manila office has a few openings for senior developers, lead developers, and we also have openings for senior UI and UX people. So if you're interested in joining me in my company, please reach out. That's it. That's everything we have for tonight. Thank you, everyone that had been in this stream. We had some technical problems, and we ran over for half an hour, but it was a really great session. And thank you everyone from all over the world who had asked their questions and made this session really fun and interactive. So that's it. Good night. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat at maraming salamat. This is Philippine.net Users Group, and to the Philippines, it's just a week ago. Happy Independence Day. Maligayang araw ng kalayaan. And we'll see you next month for another session. Bye-bye.